The locksmith was still tightening the last screw when the pantry shelf moved. It slid forward about an inch, stopped, then eased back into place. He looked at me. I looked at the deadbolt he had just installed. A second later, something scraped behind the kitchen wall. This is the last broadcast files, where some stories were never meant to find you. I had called them because things in my apartment kept changing while I was at work. Small things, a mug in the sink, the bathroom fan running, a loaf of bread closed in a way I never closed it. Nothing was missing, which somehow made it harder to explain. I worked mornings at a wholesale bakery. My shift started at 4, so I usually left home around 3:40 and came back before noon, smelling like fryer oil and flour. Most afternoons, I slept with a box fan beside the bed. The building was called Clifton Arms. It had been renovated in pieces over about 40 years, and none of those pieces matched. The lobby had a touchscreen intercom. The elevator still had brass doors that shook before opening. My kitchen looked new until you pulled out a drawer and found old green paint underneath. I lived in 9C. The pantry beside the refrigerator was narrow and almost useless. Cereal, canned soup, paper towels. Above the counter was a round brass plate buried under so much paint that it looked like a coin pressed into the wall. I assumed it had belonged to some old buzzer system. The first thing I noticed was the mug. I came home on a Tuesday and found it in the sink with a wet ring around the bottom. There was a long spoon inside it. I kept those spoons in a jar on top of the refrigerator. I rarely used them because reaching the jar meant dragging over a chair. I stood there trying to remember whether I had made coffee before work. I couldn't. That wasn't unusual. At that hour, I had put milk in a cupboard more than once, so I washed the mug and went to bed. 2 days later, the bathroom fan was running. Then the bread happened. Once I opened a loaf, I folded the plastic underneath it. I hated twist ties. This bag had been pulled tight and twisted 6 times. I remember counting because it seemed so unnecessary. That was when I called the building manager. Dean came up that afternoon. He checked the windows, the front lock, and the balcony door, even though the balcony was barely deep enough to stand on. He asked if anything was missing. Nothing was. 3 men were renovating 9D, the empty apartment next to mine. One of them was waiting in the hallway with a sheet of drywall, while Dean checked my lock. He asked if the construction kept me awake. I told him I slept with a box fan. I even joked that they could take down the whole kitchen and I probably wouldn't hear it. That sentence bothered me later. At the time, it was just something I said because the conversation had gone quiet. Dean checked the work orders and said no one from maintenance had entered my unit. Then he suggested mice. I wanted it to be mice. I bought 2 traps and scattered a thin line of flour across the kitchen floor before leaving for work. When I came home, the line was broken. No paw prints, just one smooth gap about the width of a shoe, starting near the pantry and ending before the living room carpet. I took 3 pictures, then I deleted 2 because, without context, they looked like pictures of a dirty floor. The woman across the hall gave me another explanation. She said some of the old keys in the building used to open more than one apartment. That sounded possible, more possible than someone coming through a wall. So I called a locksmith myself. He replaced the deadbolt and installed a sensor that logged every opening. I also put a small camera on the bookshelf facing the front door. For 9 days, nothing happened. The log stayed clean. The camera showed only me. By the 6th day, I had stopped checking the footage. By the 9th, I apologized to Dean. I told my sister I had probably mixed up a few things because I was exhausted. I threw away the traps, and clean the flour from the grout. That was the safest I felt during the whole thing. Then my sister stayed over. We ordered food, watched most of a bad movie, and fell asleep in the living room. Around 2 in the morning, she touched my shoulder and asked who was moving furniture upstairs. There was a low rolling sound from the kitchen. Then 3 dull bumps. I told her it was probably the pipes. She sat up and listened. The sound came again, not above us, behind the pantry. The next morning, we emptied the shelves. My sister was the one who noticed the back panel was warm, not hot, just warmer than the side walls. The panel was held in place by painted screws. Most looked old. 2 were clean and silver. I called Dean again. He came up with 2 workers from 9D. One pressed on the panel and said there was probably a plumbing chase behind it. The other stayed near the doorway, wiping dust from his hands onto his shirt. I couldn't tell whether either of them was the man who had asked about my sleep schedule. They wore the same gray work shirts, and I had never really looked at their faces. Dean said there was concrete behind the pantry. I asked why concrete needed a removable panel. Nobody answered. That afternoon, I searched the city property site. Clifton Arms had originally been a residential hotel. The oldest floor plan showed a narrow service corridor running behind the kitchens. Staff could move between rooms without using the main hallway. A renovation drawing from the late 80s said the corridor had been sealed. The exact word was inaccessible. Not removed, not filled. Inaccessible. I sent the drawing to Dean. He replied that old plans were unreliable and warned me not to remove the pantry because I could damage plumbing. That made me trust him less. I wedged a rubber stop beneath the front door and removed one of the clean screws. It was barely an inch long. There was empty space behind it. I put it back. The next morning, I left at my usual time, drove 2 blocks and parked behind a closed pharmacy. I waited 20 minutes, then returned through the rear stairwell. I didn't tell Dean. I didn't tell my sister. I should have. I locked myself in the bedroom, turned on the box fan, and sat on the floor beside the bed. For the first half hour, I felt ridiculous, then bored, then uncomfortable, because I needed to use the bathroom and didn't want to make noise. Almost an hour passed before the fan seemed to change pitch. It took me a few seconds to understand why. Another sound had started beneath it. Wood pressing slowly against wood. I opened the bedroom door. The pantry door was open. The bottom shelf had moved forward with the cans still sitting on it. Behind them was a dark gap where the back wall should have been. At first, I thought I was looking at a pipe. Then, fingers curled around the edge. A hand felt along the inside of the cabinet, slow and careful, like whoever was there was checking whether I had moved anything. I backed into the bedroom and called emergency services. While I whispered the address, a man pulled himself halfway through the pantry, gray work shirt, dust across one shoulder. One of the men from 9D. He saw me. He didn't look surprised. He looked irritated, like I had come home early and made his day more difficult. Then he dropped backward into the opening and pulled the panel shut. The pantry looked normal again. I heard quick steps behind the cabinets, then a metal door slam somewhere farther down the wall. 2 officers searched my apartment first. A third went into 9D with the site supervisor. They found the service corridor open behind a section of removed drywall, but nobody was inside. Dean kept saying he had no idea it was there. The man wasn't employed by the building. He worked for a subcontractor doing demolition in 9D. The company gave police his name, but by that evening he had stopped answering calls. The city inspector came the next morning. They found 6 opened access panels across 3 floors. Some led into empty apartments, 2 led into occupied ones. He hadn't been taking money or electronics, Mostly, he used the apartments while people were gone. Food, showers, chargers, somewhere quiet to sit between shifts. That explained the mug and the bathroom fan. It also explained things I hadn't connected. 2 missing dish towels had been folded beneath an old metal access door so it wouldn't clang. Felt pads from my dining chairs were stuck behind the pantry panel. The long spoon had been bent and used to lift an old latch. When the inspector removed the pantry, I finally saw the corridor. It was less than 2 feet wide. Old tile, bare pipes, small wooden service doors with room numbers painted on the back. My door was marked 907. The number had been wiped clean recently. The inspector found a homemade latch attached to the back of my pantry panel. It was built from cabinet hardware and a strip of metal cut from a baking tray. He looked at it for a while, then asked whether I had ever removed the pantry myself. I said no. He explained that the latch couldn't have been installed from inside the service corridor. Whoever made it had to be standing in my kitchen. That meant the man had come in before the mug, before the fan, long enough to empty the pantry, remove the back, build a silent entrance, and put everything back where he thought it belonged. I moved out before the city finished sealing the corridor. A few weeks later, I was unpacking groceries in the new apartment when I found the old bread bag at the bottom of a moving box. The twist tie was still wrapped around it. 6 tight turns. I counted them, threw the bag away, then took it back out and counted again. That was the part I had gotten wrong. The bread wasn't a mistake. It was a test, and I had gone to work at 3:40 the next morning, exactly like always.